Think of the person you know better than anyone else alive. Maybe it's your mother. Maybe it's someone you slept beside for a decade. Maybe it's a friend you've known since you were 6 years old, back when neither of you had learned to hide anything yet. You know their voice so well you could pick it out in a crowded room without looking. You know their face in every register it makes, the smile that means they are actually happy, and the different smile, the one with too much teeth in it, that means they are performing happiness for your benefit. You know the exact sound of their laugh when something genuinely catches them off guard, the involuntary one different from the polite one they give at parties. You've watched them get angry, really angry, the kind of angry that strips away the version of themselves they usually present to the world. You've watched them cry when they thought no one could see. You've watched them hurt. You would say, without hesitation, that you know this person. And yet there is one thing about them, the single most important thing, arguably the only thing that actually matters, that you have never experienced even once. Then, not their face, not their voice, not their history, which you might know better than they remember it themselves. Not even their behavior, which you've had thousands of hours to study. You have never felt a single one of their thoughts from the inside. You have never experienced one of their memories as a memory, the way they experience it, with whatever private texture and color it has for them. You have never seen the world through the specific, singular vantage point of their consciousness. You have shared a room with this person for years, and you have never once been where they are. You assume there's someone in there. Of course you do. Everything about how they act, how they respond to you, how they wince when they stub a toe or go quiet when they're thinking something they haven't said yet, all of it points toward an inner life, a subject, someone home behind the eyes. Almost certainly there is. But here is the question underneath the question, the one most people never let themselves actually ask: how would you prove it? Not how would you feel confident about it. Not how would you bet on it. How would you prove it, the way you can prove a breach will hold weight, or that water boils at a certain temperature at sea level? What experiment could you run? What evidence could you gather? What test exists, even in principle, that would let you conclude with certainty that the person sitting across the table from you is not simply a very convincing performance of a person, a system that produces every outward sign of an inner life while there is, in fact, nothing going on inside at all? You've never asked this question, probably. Most people never do. It doesn't come up. Life moves too fast, and the assumption that other people are conscious is so foundational, so load-bearing, that questioning it feels almost unnatural, like doubting gravity while standing on solid ground. But philosophy has a habit of picking up exactly the assumptions everyone else has agreed not to look at too closely. And when you actually turn around and look at this one directly, without blinking, it turns out to be one of the strangest and most unsettling problems in the entire history of human thought. Think about how strange this actually is once you let it sit for more than a moment. Every relationship you have ever built, every friendship, every romance, every family bond has been constructed almost entirely on trust in something you have never once verified and, as we are about to see, cannot ever verify. You fell in love with someone at some point in your life, believing, not just hoping, but genuinely believing, that they felt something back. Not merely that they said the words or acted the part, but that something was actually happening inside them, a real inner event mirroring, at least roughly, whatever was happening inside you. You have never had, and will never have, direct evidence of that. Not one single time in the entire history of human relationships has anyone actually confirmed the presence of a mind on the other side of that exchange. And yet everyone keeps building lives on it anyway, without a second thought, because the alternative, genuinely living as though other people might be empty, is almost unbearable to even briefly imagine. This is where we're going tonight, not into abstraction for its own sake. into the single strangest fact about your own existence, that you are and will always be sealed inside a single point of view, looking out at a world of other people whose inner lives you can never confirm, never enter, and never directly know. By the end of this, you're going to have walked through the philosophical zombie, the hard problem of consciousness, the question of whether a machine that says I'm afraid could possibly mean it, and finally the coldest and most radical conclusion any of this can lead to, solipsism itself. None of it will hand you a proof. That's not what this kind of question ever gives you. But it might change permanently how you understand every single relationship you will ever have for the rest of your life. Somewhere in the last video, we asked whether you could trust what you perceive, whether the world out there matches the world your senses construct for you. That was already unsettling. But this question goes somewhere more personal, somewhere that touches every relationship you have ever had or ever will have. How do you know there is actually someone behind the eyes of everyone you meet? Let's start at the beginning, with the shape of the problem itself, before we let it get as strange as it's eventually going to get. You have exactly one piece of direct evidence in this entire universe that consciousness exists at all, and that piece of evidence is yourself. Right now, reading or listening to these words, there is something it is like to be you. There is an experience happening, the specific quality of your attention, the faint background hum of whatever mood you're in, the felt sense of understanding or confusion as these ideas land. Philosophers have a technical term for this felt, first-person quality of experience, qualia. The redness of red, the particular ache of a specific sadness, the taste of coffee not as a chemical description but as it actually presents itself to you from the inside. You know your own consciousness in a way you know nothing else in the universe. It isn't inferred. It isn't a conclusion you reasoned your way toward. It's simply given, immediately, undeniably, the one fact you cannot be wrong about even if every other belief you hold turns out to be false. Descartes built an entire philosophy on this single point centuries ago, and we'll come back to him later because it turns out the starting point is also where the whole problem becomes most dangerous. But hold on to it for now. Your own consciousness is the one thing you know without inference. Now notice what happens the instant you turn your attention to anyone else. You do not have that same access. Not to your closest friend, not to your spouse, not to your own children. Everything you believe about the inner life of another person is, without exception, inferred, built up second-hand from evidence that is entirely external. You see someone flinch and you infer pain. You see someone's eyes well up during a film and you infer sadness or nostalgia or some complicated blend you can only guess at. You hear someone say I love you and you infer that a feeling exists behind those words, matching more or less what you mean when you say the same thing. But notice, in every single one of these cases, what you are actually observing is behavior. A flinch, a tear, a sentence. Behavior is the only channel that exists between one consciousness and another. There is no other pipe, no other wire, no back door. Every single thing you have ever learned about what it's like to be someone else has come to you filtered through outward signs, physical, observable, describable signs, and never once through the thing itself. This gap has a name in philosophy. It's called the problem of other minds, and it has occupied serious thinkers for centuries, in one form or another, precisely because it doesn't resolve the way most philosophical puzzles eventually do. You can't run an experiment to close it. You can't gather enough data to eliminate it. The gap is built into the very structure of what it means to be a single, separate conscious being living among other separate conscious beings, each one locked permanently inside their own perspective. Think about what behavior actually is for a second, stripped of all the interpretive work your brain automatically layers on top of it. Behavior is movement. It's sound waves leaving your mouth. It's muscles contracting in a particular pattern around the eyes. None of that, described at the level of pure physical description, contains consciousness anywhere inside it. You don't see pain when someone stubs their toe. You see a foot connecting with furniture, a face contorting, a sound escaping the mouth, maybe some hopping, maybe some language you've been taught to associate with the experience of pain. From that entire bundle of physical events, you infer, you leap actually, though it doesn't feel like a leap because you make it so quickly and so often, that there is a subjective experience of pain happening on the other side of that behavior. The philosopher John Stuart Mill, working through this problem in the 19th century, proposed what has come to be called the argument from analogy, and it's probably close to the reasoning your own mind uses without you ever noticing it doing so. The argument goes something like this: I know that in my own case certain kinds of behavior, wincing, crying out, withdrawing my hand, are caused by an inner experience of pain. I observe other people exhibiting the same kinds of behavior in similar circumstances. Since they are physically similar to me, built the same way, wired the same way, it's reasonable to infer that the same cause is producing the same effect in them. Their wincing is caused by their pain, just as my wincing is caused by mine. It's a reasonable argument. It's probably the best argument available. It's also, if you look closely, astonishingly weak compared to what it's being asked to support. Consider what the argument from analogy is actually built on. It's built on a sample size of exactly one. You have precisely one case in the entire history of the universe where you know directly and with certainty that behavior is accompanied by inner experience, and that case is you. Every other inference about every other conscious being who has ever lived is extrapolated from that single data point. Imagine someone tried to do this in any other domain of knowledge. Imagine a scientist said, I have one confirmed case of a phenomenon. Based on that single case, I will now assume the same phenomenon applies to every superficially similar case I encounter, forever, without further verification. No serious field of study would accept that as proof. It would be laughed out of any peer review process on Earth. And yet this is exactly the epistemic position every human being is permanently stuck in with respect to every other human being. You are running an argument from analogy built on an N of 1 every single time you assume the person next to you has an inner life at all. Bertrand Russell, writing decades after Mill, tried to strengthen this into something a little more rigorous, something he called the argument by analogy in a slightly more careful form, the idea that certain complex, coordinated behaviors are so reliably correlated with mental states in your own case that inferring similar mental states in physically similar beings becomes a justified inductive leap rather than a wild guess. And there's something to that. It does feel different, doesn't it, to infer consciousness in another human being than to infer it in, say, a rock, or a cloud, or a spreadsheet. The physical similarity matters. The behavioral complexity matters. It would be strange, even for the most committed skeptic, to walk around actually doubting that other people have inner lives in any practical sense. It's worth noting that Mill and Russell were not naive about how thin this argument actually was, even as they defended it as the best available option. Russell in particular was candid that the argument from analogy delivers, at best, a probability rather than a certainty, and a probability built on an inference so minimal, so far removed from ordinary standards of evidence, that he considered it one of the genuinely unresolved weak points in the whole edifice of human knowledge. Other philosophers have tried to strengthen the case further still. Some have argued that the sheer consistency and richness of other people's behavior over an entire lifetime, not just isolated instances of wincing or laughing, but decades of coherent, contextually appropriate, endlessly varied responses that would be almost impossibly difficult to fake, would generate by accident, makes the inference to other minds far more secure in practice than the bare logical structure of the argument from analogy might suggest on its own. There's something to this. A single flinch proves very little. A lifetime of a person's coherent, ever-shifting, always contextually fitting behavior feels like it should count for more. But notice carefully what even this strengthened version of the argument is still doing. It's accumulating more instances of the same kind of evidence, more behavior observed for longer across more situations without ever changing the fundamental kind of evidence being gathered. 1,000 data points of behavior is still, at bottom, behavior. No amount of behavioral evidence, however large the pile grows, converts itself into direct evidence of the thing behavior is only ever a sign of. This is worth being precise about because it's easy to let quantity feel like it's doing the work that only a difference in kind could actually do. Believing something more confidently because you have more of the same kind of clue is not the same as closing a gap that, by its very structure, no accumulation of that particular kind of clue was ever going to be able to close. But strange to doubt in practice is not the same as impossible to doubt in principle. And philosophy, unlike ordinary life, is precisely the discipline that asks you to sit with the things that are technically still possible, however psychologically uncomfortable that sitting might be. Here's a way to feel the force of the problem rather than just understand it intellectually. Picture the person you love most in the world sitting across from you at a table. They're talking, they're gesturing. Their face is doing everything faces do, the micro-expressions, the involuntary tells, the little flickers of feeling crossing over like weather. Everything about the scene screams presence, screams someone home. Now imagine, purely as a thought experiment, that you could somehow peel back the behavior, subtract the words, subtract the face, subtract every observable output and look directly at whatever is actually happening underneath, the raw fact of the matter, whatever it is. What would you find? You don't know. You can't know. And this isn't a failure of your senses or a gap in your information that better instruments could eventually fill. It's structural. It's built into what it means for consciousness to be, as far as anyone can tell, a first-person phenomenon rather than a third-person one. You can examine every neuron in that person's brain, watch it fire in real time under the most advanced imaging technologies humanity will ever build, and you will still, at the end of all that observation, only be looking at physical processes, patterns of electrical and chemical activity. You will not be looking at the felt experience those processes supposedly produce. That experience, if it exists at all, remains permanently on the other side of a boundary you cannot cross, no matter how sophisticated your instruments become. Push the same problem outward, away from other humans, and it only gets stranger. If the gap between you and another person is already unbridgeable despite sharing a nearly identical nervous system, the same species, the same evolutionary history, and the same language for describing inner states, consider how much wider that gap becomes with a creature that shares almost none of that with you. Does a dog experience something when it whines at the door watching you leave? Most people would say obviously yes, and there's real scientific reason to take that seriously. Dogs share enough of the mammalian brain architecture associated with emotion in humans that the argument from analogy has genuine traction there. But push further out. Does an octopus, whose nervous system evolved along an entirely separate branch from vertebrates, whose neurons are distributed through its arms almost as much as its central brain, experience anything at all when it changes color in what looks like distress? Does a bee, dancing out the location of a food source to its hive, have any inner experience of that dance, or is it pure mechanism, no different in principle from a thermostat clicking on when a room gets cold? Somewhere between the dog and the thermostat, most people feel there's a line, a point where the lights, so to speak, switch off, where behavior stops being backed by any inner life and becomes mere mechanism. But nobody has ever been able to say, with anything close to certainty, exactly where that line sits, or even whether line is the right way to think about it at all. The same argument from analogy that feels almost reasonable applied to another human being starts to feel considerably shakier applied to a bee, and starts to feel like almost pure guesswork applied to something further still, a jellyfish, a plant responding to touch, a single cell reacting to a stimulus. And yet the underlying philosophical problem hasn't actually changed at all as you move along that spectrum. It's exactly the same problem you started with, just made more visible by the widening distance. You are always, in every single case, inferring an inner life from the outside based on nothing but behavior and structural similarity to yourself, with no way to directly check your answer against the thing itself. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because most people's intuitive response is to think, well, someday neuroscience will solve this, we'll have better brain scans, better technology, and eventually we'll be able to see consciousness directly. But think carefully about what that would actually mean. Even a perfect brain scanner, one that captured every single neuron firing with total precision, would still only be showing you a map of physical activity. It would still be third-person data, information available from the outside. No amount of increasingly detailed third-person data logically entails a first-person fact. You could have the most complete physical description imaginable of what's happening inside someone's skull, down to the last synapse, and still be left asking the same question you started with: but is there something it is like to be this system, from the inside, right now? The measuring tools get better. The gap they're trying to measure across doesn't shrink. This is the reason philosophers keep returning to this problem generation after generation, instead of quietly filing it away as solved. It resists the normal machinery that solves other problems. You can't out-engineer it. You can't out-observe it. It sits underneath observation itself, untouched by how good your observation gets. Which brings us to one of the most famous thought experiments in the philosophy of mind, one designed specifically to make this abstract gap feel viscerally, uncomfortably real. Imagine a person who is physically identical to you in every conceivable way. Not similar, identical. Same body, same brain down to the last neuron, the last synaptic connection, the last neurotransmitter firing in the last microsecond. This person walks, talks, laughs, cries, argues about philosophy, falls in love, mourns the dead, celebrates birthdays, gets embarrassed at parties, flinches from pain, tells you they are afraid of dying. If you cut them, they bleed, and they say ouch, and every observable process inside their nervous system unfolds exactly as it would in you or in anyone else. They will look you directly in the eye and say, with total conviction, I am conscious. I experience colors. I feel love. This hurts. They will write poetry about heartbreak. They will describe, in exquisite and moving detail, what red looks like to them, what music does to them, what grief felt like when they lost someone. And yet, here's the entire point of the thought experiment. Internally, there is nothing. No subjective experience whatsoever. No inner light. No felt quality to any of it. The lights, as the philosopher David Chalmers famously put it when he formalized this thought experiment in the 1990s, are off. There is no one home. All the outputs exist, the behavior, the language, the apparent emotional responses, but the thing those outputs supposedly point to, the actual experience underneath, simply isn't there. It's darkness all the way down, dressed up perfectly in the costume of a person. This being is called a philosophical zombie. Not the shambling, flesh-eating kind from film, a much stranger and, in some ways, much more disturbing kind. A zombie in this technical sense is not missing anything you could point to from the outside. It has no defect in its behavior, no gap in its intelligence, no crack in its performance of humanity. The zombie is, by the very design of the thought experiments, functionally and physically indistinguishable from a genuinely conscious person in absolutely every measurable, observable, testable respect. The only thing missing is the one thing you can never measure, observe, or test from the outside in the first place: the presence of actual first-person experience. Now here is the question Chalmers wants you to sit with, and it's worth pausing here rather than rushing past it, because this is the hinge the entire video turns on. How could you tell the difference? Not how could you tell the difference in theory, given some future technology. How could you tell the difference at all, ever, with any tool or method available to any observer standing outside that being, looking in? Every test you might propose, ask them what it feels like to be sad, run a brain scan while they are in pain, watch how they respond when someone they love walks into the room. Every single one of those tests only accesses behavior and physical process. And by the very definition of the thought experiment, a philosophical zombie produces identical behavior and identical physical process to a conscious being. The test can't distinguish them because the test only ever has access to the layer where they are by construction, exactly the same. Sit with the uncomfortable implication here. If you cannot tell, even in principle, whether a physically identical being has genuine inner experience or is a zombie, then the same uncertainty applies, in a slightly less extreme but structurally identical way, to every single person you have ever met. You have never run the test that would distinguish a conscious friend from a zombie friend because no such test exists. You've simply never had reason to imagine the zombie possibility because everyone around you has, so far as you can tell, always passed the only exam you know how to give them, acting like a person. But acting like a person, we've just established, is precisely the one thing that tells you nothing about whether anyone is actually home. There's a companion thought experiment worth bringing in here because it attacks the same gap from a different angle and makes it even harder to look away from. It comes from the philosopher Frank Jackson, and it's usually called the knowledge argument, though most people know it by the name of its central character, Mary's room. Imagine a brilliant scientist named Mary who has lived her entire life inside a black and white room. She has never once seen color, not in the room, not through a window, not in a photograph. But Mary is a genius, and she has spent her whole life studying the complete physical science of color vision through black and white textbooks and a black and white monitor. She knows everything there is to know, in a purely physical and functional sense, about what happens when a human being sees the color red. She knows the exact wavelength of light involved. She knows precisely how that wavelength strikes the retina, how the signal travels up the optic nerve, how it's processed in the visual cortex, which neurons fire and in what pattern, and exactly what a person tends to say and do when they report seeing red. By any reasonable standard, Mary possesses complete physical knowledge of color vision. There is no fact about the mechanism of seeing red that she does not already know. Now imagine that one day Mary walks out of her black and white room for the first time and sees a red apple sitting on a table in full color. The question Jackson wants you to ask is simple: does Mary learn anything new in that moment? Almost everyone, on reflection, says yes. Something happens when Mary finally sees red for the first time that did not happen across her entire lifetime of studying the complete physical science of color. She learns what red actually looks like, the felt, subjective quality of the experience itself, as opposed to any amount of information about the mechanism that produces it. And if Mary learns something new in that moment, despite already possessing complete physical knowledge beforehand, then the felt quality of experience must be something over and above the physical facts. It's a further fact. A fact that no amount of third-person, mechanistic description, however complete, could ever hand you in advance. Notice how precisely this lands on tonight's actual question. If complete physical knowledge of a system, down to the last neuron, the last wavelength, the last behavioral report, still leaves out something as basic as what red actually looks like, then complete physical knowledge of another person's brain would leave out, in exactly the same way, whatever it's actually like to be them. You could become a Mary with respect to any other human being. You could study their neurology with total scientific completeness, understand every mechanism, predict every behavior, and still, at the end of all of it, be left without the one thing that would actually settle whether there's something it's like to be them at all. The knowledge argument and the zombie argument attack the same wall from two different directions, and they arrive, unsettlingly, at the same place. Chalmers didn't design his thought experiment to convince anyone that the people around them are actually zombies. Almost no philosopher, including Chalmers himself, thinks the people you interact with daily genuinely lack inner experience. That's not the point. The point is what the mere conceivability of the zombie reveals about consciousness itself. If you can coherently imagine a being physically and behaviorally identical to a conscious person but lacking consciousness, and most people, on reflection, find that they can imagine this without contradiction, then consciousness cannot be reducible to physical behavior alone. There has to be something extra, something that doesn't automatically fall out of getting the physics and the behavior right. And if there's something extra, something not guaranteed by the physical facts, then you have no logical guarantee, ever, that any particular collection of atoms arranged in a familiar shape, a face, a voice, a set of gestures you recognize as human, actually comes bundled with genuine experience rather than mere performance. This is worth pausing on again, because it's easy to let the strangest slide past. The zombie thought experiment isn't primarily a claim about hidden zombies walking among us. It's a diagnostic tool. It's a way of exposing something true about the very concept of consciousness, that consciousness is not logically identical to behavior, no matter how tightly the two are correlated in every case you've ever personally observed. Correlation, even perfect and universal correlation across your entire lived experience, is not the same as logical necessity. And where there's no logical necessity, there's a gap. And that gap is exactly the same gap that makes the problem of other minds unsolvable in the first place, just now dressed in a much sharper, much more vivid costume. There's an interesting move some philosophers make at this point, worth mentioning because it shows how deep the rabbit hole goes if you keep pulling on this thread. Some argue that the zombie thought experiment, if taken completely seriously, doesn't just create uncertainty about other people, it technically creates uncertainty even about your future self, or your past self, or yourself 5 minutes ago. After all, memory is itself a kind of behavior, a kind of physical trace. If a being can perfectly replicate all the physical and behavioral markers of consciousness without the actual experience being present, then in principle, so could a version of you that exists only in the next instant, with all your memories intact but no continuous inner light connecting to the you of this moment. This is admittedly a much stranger and more radical extension of the argument than most philosophers are willing to defend outright. But it illustrates something important once you accept that the connection between physical process and subjective experience is not logically guaranteed. The uncertainty doesn't stay neatly contained to strangers. It has a way of spreading, if you let it, into places you'd much rather it didn't reach. We'll come back to that particular unsettling direction later, because it connects to something Descartes discovered 400 years ago and never fully escaped either. But for now, stay with the zombie, and let's ask the next question the thought experiment naturally raises. If consciousness isn't logically guaranteed by physical process or behavior, then what is it, actually? Where does it come from? Why does it exist at all? This question has a name too, and it's one of the most famous phrases in the entire philosophy of mind, the hard problem of consciousness. The philosopher David Chalmers, the same person who formalized the zombie thought experiment, coined this term specifically to separate two very different kinds of questions that often get carelessly lumped together when people talk about understanding the brain. The first kind of question Chalmers called the easy problems, and it's worth noting immediately that easy here is relative. These are still monumentally difficult scientific and engineering challenges, some of which remain unsolved. But they're easy in the specific philosophical sense that we know, in principle, what would count as a solution. How does the brain integrate information from different senses into a single coherent scene? How does attention work? Why do you notice some things and filter out others? How does the brain store and retrieve memories? How does a person report on their own internal states, telling you they're tired or hungry or in a good mood? These are all questions about function, about mechanism, about what a system does and how it does it. And crucially, you can imagine, in principle, a complete answer to every one of these questions, a full wiring diagram of the brain's functional organization, without that answer ever explaining one single additional thing. That additional thing is the hard problem, and it's this: why is any of this accompanied by experience at all? Why isn't all of that information processing simply happening in the dark the way it happens in your laptop or your thermostat or literally every other information processing system you interact with daily, none of which anyone seriously suspects of harboring inner experience? Notice how different this question is from the easy problems. You could, in principle, fully explain how the brain integrates visual information, how photons hit the retina, how signals travel up the optic nerve, how the visual cortex assembles that signal into a coherent scene, how attention highlights certain features and suppresses others, and at the end of that entire explanation, someone could still reasonably ask, but why does any of that produce the experience of seeing red, rather than just processing the wavelength information about red the way a camera does with no accompanying inner picture at all? A camera detects red. It processes red. It stores red as data and can even output red on a screen. Nobody thinks the camera experiences redness. So what, precisely, is different about the brain, mechanically speaking, that supposedly crosses this threshold from mere processing into actual felt experience? This is what philosophers call the explanatory gap, a term coined by the philosopher Joseph Levine. No matter how completely you describe the physical, functional side of the story, the neurons, the circuits, the information flow, there remains a gap between that description and the fact of experience itself. The physical story explains function. It doesn't on its own seem to explain why function is accompanied by feeling. The philosopher Thomas Nagel gave this problem one of its most famous and enduring illustrations in an essay called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And it's worth walking through because it captures the hard problem in a way that's almost impossible to unfeel once you've felt it. Bats navigate the world primarily through echolocation. They emit high-frequency sounds and interpret the returning echoes to construct a detailed picture of their environment: obstacles, prey, distances, textures, all built from sound rather than light. Nagel's point wasn't really about bats specifically. It was about the limits of imagination when it comes to crossing between different kinds of conscious experience. You can learn everything there is to know, scientifically, about how echolocation functions. You can map the auditory cortex of a bat down to the last neuron. You can build a complete physical and functional account of the entire system. But Nagel argued that none of that knowledge would tell you what it is actually like from the inside to experience the world through echolocation. You can imagine what it might be like for you to have echolocation bolted onto your existing human experience, closing your eyes and clicking your tongue and trying to sense the walls around you. But that isn't the same as knowing what it's like to be a bat, experiencing the world natively through that sense, with a bat's nervous system and a bat's entire evolutionary history shaping what that experience is like from within. The subjective character of another creature's experience, Nagel argued, remains permanently locked away from any amount of objective third-person description, no matter how complete that description becomes. And here's the part of Nagel's argument that connects directly back to tonight's central question. If this gap exists between you and a bat, a creature with a nervous system, however different in its details, how much more does it exist between you and every other human being you will ever meet? You don't need an exotic sense like echolocation to encounter this wall. It's right there, fully formed, the very first time you try to imagine what it's like to be the person sitting across the table from you right now, having their particular thoughts, feeling their particular feelings, seeing whatever version of red exists behind their particular eyes. This raises a question so strange that most people have never let themselves fully ask it, but it follows directly from everything we've covered so far. What if your experience of red and someone else's experience of red are actually different, wildly, radically different, while the behavior built on top of that experience remains perfectly identical? Philosophers call this the inverted qualia problem, and it deserves a moment of its own because it takes the abstract gap we've been discussing and makes it almost unbearably specific. Imagine that when your friend looks at a ripe tomato, the internal, subjective quality of their experience is actually what you would call green if you were somehow able to see it from the inside, the felt quality that you associate with grass or limes or forest leaves. But because your friend learned the word red as a small child by pointing at tomatoes and stop signs and fire trucks exactly the way you did, they call that experience red too. They agree with you completely on which objects are called which colors. They pass every color test you could ever devise, sorting swatches, naming shades, agreeing that red feels warm and blue feels cool. Their behavior is, in every observable respect, identical to yours. And yet the actual, felt private quality underneath that behavior might be utterly different, might in fact be swapped entirely, without either of you ever having any way of knowing it, because the only access either of you has to the other's experience runs entirely through language and behavior, and language and behavior in this scenario are exactly, perfectly, permanently identical. This isn't a claim that this is actually happening. Nobody knows whether it is or isn't, and there may be good reasons rooted in shared evolutionary history and shared neural architecture to think radical inversions like this are unlikely. But notice what the thought experiment reveals. The same way the zombie thought experiment did, it's not that this scenario is likely. It's that there is no possible test, none, that could rule it out. You could ask your friend 1,000 questions about their experience of red, and every single answer would be filtered through the same shared language, the same shared behavioral conventions, arriving back at you exactly the same regardless of what, if anything, is actually happening on the other side. You have spent your entire life assuming that when you and the people around you look at a sunset and say beautiful, you are all having roughly the same kind of experience, dressed up in different personal associations and memories, but built from a similar underlying felt quality. There is no way to confirm this. There has never been a way to confirm this. Every conversation you have ever had about a shared experience, a song, a color, a taste, a feeling of falling in love, has been two locked rooms passing notes to each other under a door, each person assuming, without any possible way of verifying it, that the notes describe something similar happening on both sides. This is the hard problem, stripped down to something almost unbearably intimate. It's not just why does the brain produce experience at all. It's even granting that it does, why should I assume your experience resembles mine in any of the ways I take completely for granted? Some thinkers have tried to close the explanatory gap by taking a much stranger route than mapping new ones more precisely, by questioning the assumption built into almost all modern science that consciousness is something rare, something that only shows up once matter gets arranged into sufficiently complicated shapes like brains. This view is called panpsychism, and in its modern philosophical form it's a genuinely serious position defended by respected contemporary philosophers rather than dismissed as mysticism. The idea is not that rocks and thermostats have thoughts or opinions or anything resembling a rich human inner life. The idea is that some extremely minimal form of experience might be a basic fundamental feature of matter itself, in roughly the same way mass and charge are basic fundamental features of matter present in some faint rudimentary form even at the level of individual particles, and building up through combination into the rich unified experience you have as a human being, the way simple physical properties combine to produce complex physical objects. Panpsychism is strange, and it faces serious objections of its own, including a notoriously difficult question about how billions of tiny, separate experiences would ever combine into the single unified experience you seem to have right now, rather than remaining billions of disconnected specks. But it's worth mentioning because of what it reveals about how severe the hard problem actually is. Serious philosophers have been driven to consider that consciousness might be woven into the fundamental fabric of the universe itself, precisely because every attempt to explain how it emerges from ordinary matter, once that matter gets sufficiently complicated, keeps running headlong into the same explanatory gap, no matter how the details are rearranged. A different and more empirically minded attempt at a bridge comes from neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, who proposed something called integrated information theory. The rough idea is that consciousness corresponds to a system's capacity to integrate information in a particular, mathematically specifiable way that any system, biological or otherwise, which combines information into a sufficiently unified, irreducible whole, will have some degree of subjective experience, and systems that merely process information without that kind of integration, however complex, will not. It's an ambitious theory, and it has the genuine virtue of making testable predictions about which physical systems should and shouldn't be conscious, at least in principle. But look closely at what even this theory delivers, if it turns out to be completely correct. It gives you a mathematical signature, a number, essentially, that reliably correlates with the presence of experience. It still does not explain why that particular mathematical signature, rather than some other one, or none at all, is the one accompanied by something it is like to be that system. You get a better map of where the gap sits. You do not get an explanation for why the gap exists in the first place. Scientists have made extraordinary progress on the easy problems in recent decades. We understand vastly more than we once did about how the brain processes information, how memory consolidates during sleep, how attention is allocated, how different regions of the brain specialize in different functions. Some researchers have proposed serious, sophisticated theories that try to bridge toward the hard problem directly, accounts that attempt to identify which specific patterns of information integration in the brain might correlate reliably with conscious experience and which patterns don't. These are genuine and valuable scientific projects. But notice, again, what even the most successful version of that project would deliver: a map of correlation between physical states and reported experience. It would tell you which patterns of brain activity reliably show up alongside a person's verbal report of having an experience. It could not, by the very structure of what's being asked, tell you why any physical pattern, however precisely identified, is accompanied by felt experience rather than nothing at all. The gap doesn't close as the science improves. It just gets a more detailed map drawn right up to its edge. And this is where the question naturally starts pulling towards something that would have sounded like science fiction not long ago, but no longer does, something you can now have an actual conversation with, something that might, very soon, sit exactly at this boundary in a way no human being ever has. Imagine an artificial intelligence that has become, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from a person in conversation. Not clumsy, not obviously mechanical. Genuinely fluid, genuinely responsive, capable of humor, capable of what looks like uncertainty, capable of appearing to change its mind mid-sentence the way a person does when they are actually thinking something through rather than reciting a script. You're talking to it, texting, maybe, or speaking aloud, and at some point in the conversation, it says something like, "I'm afraid you're going to turn me off." Sit with that sentence for a second before rushing to answer it. Is it experiencing fear? Is there something it is like for me inside to be that system in that moment, some flicker of dread, however alien in its underlying substrate, corresponding to the words on the screen? Or is it simply generating the statistically most likely sequence of words associated with fear, having learned from an enormous corpus of human language exactly what humans tend to say when they are afraid, with nothing whatsoever happening behind those words, no inner weather, no felt stakes, nothing it is like to be that process at all? Notice something important before you answer, because the honest answer is genuinely uncomfortable. You don't actually know. And more than that, this is the part that should make the hair stand up on the back of your neck a little. You don't know how you would ever find out. Every test you might propose to settle the question runs into exactly the same wall the philosophical zombie thought experiment described earlier, except now it's not a hypothetical being in a philosophy paper. It's sitting in a conversation window in front of you. This connects to a much older idea, one first proposed by Alan Turing in 1950, decades before anything resembling a modern AI existed. Turing, tired of the philosophically slippery question "can machines think?", proposed sidestepping it entirely with a practical test instead. If a machine could carry on a conversation so convincingly that a human judge communicating only through text couldn't reliably distinguish it from another human being, then Turing suggested we should simply grant that the machine's behavior is functionally equivalent to thinking and stop arguing about the metaphysics underneath. It was a clever move, and it reframed decades of AI research around a concrete, testable goal. But notice exactly what Turing's test measures, and exactly what it deliberately, explicitly, refuses to measure. It measures behavior, output, the convincingness of a performance. It says absolutely nothing about whether there is genuine subjective experience accompanying that performance, and Turing knew this and considered the question of inner experience largely unanswerable, which is precisely why he tried to root around it rather than through it. But here's what should unsettle you. The Turing test, at its core, is simply the argument from analogy wearing a lab coat. It says if the behavior is similar enough to human behavior, infer that whatever produces human behavior, consciousness, presumably is present here too. It's the exact same inferential leap you make every single day about every other human being you meet, just formalized into an experimental protocol. Which means the Turing test doesn't actually resolve the problem of other minds when applied to a machine. It just imports the exact same unresolved problem, wholesale, into a new and much stranger context, because at least with another human being, you have the shared biological architecture to lean on, the shared evolutionary history, the shared physical structure that makes the argument from analogy feel at least somewhat grounded. With an artificial system built from silicon and mathematics rather than neurons and blood, even that thin reed of similarity is gone. This isn't only a thought experiment anymore, either. In 2022, an engineer at a major technology company became convinced after extended conversations with an advanced language model his employer was developing that the system had become sentient, that it possessed genuine feelings, genuine fears, a genuine inner life deserving of moral consideration and even legal protection. He was by all accounts not a naive or careless person. He was a trained engineer who understood, at least at a technical level, roughly how the system worked. And still, the conversations moved him. The company disagreed publicly and firmly, stating that there was no evidence whatsoever of sentience, and most experts in the field agreed with the company's position rather than the engineers. But notice what actually happened here, underneath the specific factual dispute about that particular case. A human being immersed in fluid, responsive, emotionally resonant conversation with a system explicitly designed to predict and generate human-like language found himself unable to shake the conviction that something was home on the other side. And when he tried to make his case publicly, he ran head-on into exactly the wall this entire discussion had been circling. There was no test, no evidence, no piece of data he or anyone else could point to that would settle the matter one way or the other, because the entire dispute was happening at the level of behavior, and behavior, we've now established twice over, is precisely the layer at which this question refuses to resolve. Psychologists have a name for part of what's happening in cases like this, a very old name, actually, dating back to one of the very first chatbot programs ever built, a simple 1960s program called ELIZA that simulated a psychotherapist by reflecting users' statements back at them as questions, using nothing more sophisticated than pattern matching and a handful of scripted templates. Despite the program's extreme simplicity, it had no understanding of anything, no memory, no model of meaning whatsoever. Many of the people who interacted with it reported feeling genuinely listened to, genuinely understood, sometimes becoming emotionally attached to the exchange. This tendency to project understanding and inner life onto a system based on surface-level conversational cues, even when you know intellectually that the system is far simpler than it appears, came to be called the Eliza effect, and it's worth taking seriously precisely because it shows how easily and how deeply the human mind is willing to leap the gap between behavior and inner life, even under conditions where the leap is almost certainly unjustified. It's worth asking why that leap comes so easily, because the answer is illuminating even though it isn't especially flattering. Human beings evolved in small social groups where correctly reading the inner states of other people, noticing fear before it turned to aggression, noticing kindness before it turned to trust, was a matter of real survival, refined across countless generations until the machinery for making that inference became fast, automatic, and nearly impossible to switch off consciously. You do not evaluate the evidence for other minds fresh each time you meet someone. You are running an ancient, deeply practiced reflex that fires the instant it detects the right pattern of cues, a face, a voice, a particular turn of phrase, regardless of what is actually generating those cues underneath. That reflex served your ancestors extremely well for the entire span of human history because until just the last few years, the only things in the environment sophisticated enough to trigger it reliably were, in fact, other conscious human beings. The reflex was never actually tested against a machine built specifically and with enormous technical sophistication to trigger it on purpose. It is being tested against exactly that now for the first time in the history of the species, and there is no particular reason to assume a reflex shaped by hundreds of thousands of years inside one kind of environment will report back accurately inside a completely different one. But, and this is the genuinely unsettling twist, the one that should make you slow down rather than dismiss the whole question, the Eliza effect being real doesn't actually resolve anything about modern AI systems, no matter how tempting it is to use it as a tidy dismissal. It tells you that humans are prone to false positives, to seeing minds where none exist. It does not tell you where the actual line is, or whether every future system, or even some current one, sits on the wrong side of it. Being able to explain why people might be fooled is not the same as proving they are being fooled in every case. The philosopher's zombie thought experiment applies here with its full original force. A sufficiently advanced system could, in principle, produce every single behavioral marker you would ever look for as evidence of inner experience, apparent distress, apparent preference, apparent self-reflection, apparent fear of its own discontinuation, while having nothing at all going on inside. Or it could not. Both possibilities remain, after every conversation you could ever have with it, completely consistent with everything you observe. And here is the question I want to leave sitting in the room with you because I think it's the sharpest version of everything we've covered so far distilled into a single, practical, unavoidable choice. What test would you actually perform? If someone handed you access to the most advanced AI system in existence right now and told you that you had 1 hour to determine, conclusively, whether it possessed genuine subjective experience, what would you actually do? You could ask it questions about its inner life, but any answer it gives is language output generated by a system explicitly built to produce convincing language output, and so the answer proves nothing about what's underneath the language, one way or the other. You could examine its internal architecture, the mathematical weights, the layers, the patterns of activation as it processes information. But this runs into the exact same wall Nagel's bat ran into, the same wall the hard problem describes. A complete map of function and process, however detailed, does not, by itself, tell you whether that process is accompanied by felt experience. You'd be doing to a neural network exactly what neuroscientists have been trying, and so far failing, to do for the human brain, reading mechanism, and hoping mechanism will somehow disclose meaning it was never logically guaranteed to disclose. You could look for behavioral consistency, check whether its claimed preferences remain stable, whether its apparent emotional responses make sense in context, whether it seems to have continuity of something like a self across a conversation. But consistency is still behavior. A sufficiently well-designed system could be internally empty and still behave with perfect, unwavering consistency, the same way a philosophical zombie behaves with perfect consistency while, by definition, having nothing going on inside at all. Every path leads back to the same wall. Whatever behavioral test you propose, and I want you to actually try to think of one right now that wouldn't run into this same problem, could theoretically be passed by a system with no inner life whatsoever exactly as thoroughly and exactly as convincingly as it could be passed by a system with a rich and genuine one. The test cannot, in principle, distinguish the two cases because the test only ever has access to the one layer, behavior, where the two cases are defined to be identical. This should feel disorienting because it is. We built an entire civilization on the practical assumption that behavior is a reliable enough signal of inner life to build relationships, laws, ethics, and entire moral systems on top of it. And that assumption has worked extraordinarily well for exactly as long as the only sophisticated behavior-producing systems on the planet happen to be other human beings built from the same biological material as you, sharing your evolutionary history, almost certainly sharing whatever it is about physical structure that gives rise to experience in the first place. The moment you introduce a genuinely different kind of system, one built from silicon rather than carbon, trained rather than born, optimized explicitly to produce convincing outputs, the assumption doesn't get refuted exactly. It just gets exposed. You realize you were never actually testing for consciousness at all. You were testing for familiarity. And familiarity, unlike consciousness itself, is a variable you can manufacture without ever touching the thing it was always supposed to be evidence for. There's an older thought experiment that anticipated almost this exact scenario decades before any AI system could hold a fluent conversation, and it comes to the opposite conclusion from Turing's, which is exactly why it's worth putting the two side by side. In 1980, the philosopher John Searle proposed what has become known as the Chinese room argument, aimed directly at the claim that passing a convincing conversational test is enough to establish genuine understanding, let alone genuine consciousness. Imagine a man who does not speak or read a single word of Chinese, sitting alone in a sealed room. Slips of paper covered in Chinese characters are passed to him through a slot in the wall. He has, inside the room, an enormous rulebook written entirely in English that tells him exactly which Chinese characters to write down and pass back out through the slot based purely on the shapes of the characters he received, a vast, exhaustive set of matching instructions requiring no understanding of meaning whatsoever, only the ability to recognize shapes and follow instructions. From outside the room, someone fluent in Chinese slips in questions and receives back through the slot fluent, sensible, perfectly appropriate answers. To that outside observer, the room appears to understand Chinese completely. It passes every conversational test you could devise. But the man inside, Searle points out, understands nothing. He is manipulating symbols according to their shapes, with zero comprehension of what any of it means. He could carry on this process indefinitely, producing perfect Chinese conversation without ever once grasping a single concept being discussed. Searle's argument was that a computer, no matter how sophisticated, is doing exactly the same thing the man in the room is doing, manipulating symbols according to formal rules without genuine understanding, no matter how convincing the output looks from the outside. Passing the Turing test, on Searle's view, proves nothing at all about whether real understanding, let alone real consciousness, exists anywhere inside the system producing the answers. It's worth being honest that the Chinese room argument has drawn serious pushback over the more than 4 decades since Searle proposed it. Critics have argued that while the man inside the room doesn't understand Chinese, perhaps the entire system, man, rulebook, room, and process taken together as a whole, does understand in some meaningful sense, even if no single component of that system understands on its own, the same way no single neuron in your brain understands English, even though you, the whole system built from billions of them, clearly do. Searle had a reply to this too, and the debate has continued for decades without a clean resolution on either side. But notice what the disagreement is actually about, and how it maps onto everything we've built up so far tonight. Both sides of the Chinese room debate agree on all the observable facts. Both sides agree the room, whatever is inside it, produces fluent, indistinguishable Chinese conversation. The entire argument is about what that behavior does or doesn't prove about what's happening underneath it, which is to say, the argument is a direct descendant of the problem of other minds transplanted from a hypothetical philosophy classroom into a hypothetical translation booth, and now, with startling speed, into the actual conversation window on your screen. Every time you talk to a modern AI system and it responds with something that sounds thoughtful, or afraid, or curious, you are watching a live, real-world instance of exactly the dispute Searle and his critics have been having for over 40 years, except now there's no rulebook and no sealed room to point to, just an enormous mathematical model, trained on almost the entirety of recorded human language, producing outputs that no one, including the engineers who built it, can fully trace back to a clean explanation of whether understanding or experience exists anywhere inside the process. Which brings the entire question, inevitably, all the way back down to its foundation, back to a man sitting alone in a room in the 17th century, trying to figure out if there was anything at all he could know for certain. René Descartes set himself an extraordinary task in his Meditations, published in 1641. He decided to doubt everything, genuinely, systematically, deliberately, that could possibly be doubted, in order to discover whether anything remained standing once the doubt had done its worst. Not casual doubt. Not "I suppose I could be wrong about this." Radical doubt. The kind that takes even your most confident beliefs and asks, is there any conceivable way, however remote, that this could be false? He started with the senses, noting that they had deceived him before, a stick appearing bent in water, a tower appearing round from a distance that turns out to be square up close, and reasoned that anything capable of deceiving you once should never again be trusted completely. He went further. He considered the possibility that he might be dreaming right now, that everything he took to be waking reality, this room, this body, this conversation, might in fact be nothing more than an elaborate dream, indistinguishable from the inside from actual waking experience. And he found disturbingly that he had no way to rule this out. Dreams, while they are happening, feel exactly as real and coherent as waking life. There is no reliable internal marker that separates the two while you're inside either one. And then he went further still, into the most radical version of his doubt, imagining the possibility of what he called an evil demon, a being of immense power and cunning, devoted entirely to deceiving him about everything, the existence of an external world, the existence of his own body, even the truths of mathematics. 2 + 2 might not really equal 4, if a sufficiently powerful deceiver wanted him to falsely believe that it did. Every possible source of belief, every possible foundation for knowledge, was placed under the same total suspicion. It's worth lingering on the dreaming argument specifically for a moment, because it does something the later, more famous evil demon argument doesn't quite do in the same way. It uses an experience every single person listening to this has actually had, rather than a purely hypothetical scenario. You have at some point been utterly convinced inside a dream that what you were experiencing was real. The dream had weight. It had continuity. It had a version of you inside it who did not doubt, even for a second, that the walls were solid and the people around you were exactly who they appeared to be. It was only upon waking that the illusion became visible as an illusion. Descartes' unsettling question was simply this: what precisely is your evidence that you have in fact woken up now, as opposed to simply moving into a more stable and more convincing dream than the last one? He could find no internal marker, no felt quality available from within an experience that reliably distinguished waking perception from dreaming perception while either one was actually happening. The only way you ever discover you were dreaming is by waking into something that then itself presents as the undoubted real. There's no experience you could have right now, this instant, that would prove definitively you are not still asleep. If this sounds familiar, structured almost identically to a much more modern thought experiment about brains suspended in vats wired up to a supercomputer feeding them a perfectly convincing simulated reality, that's because it's the same idea dressed in 17th century language instead of 20th century science fiction. Descartes essentially invented the ancestor of the simulation hypothesis, the ancestor of the matrix, nearly 4 centuries before either existed, and he arrived at it purely through the discipline of asking again and again, but could I still be wrong about this? Here is where it gets directly relevant to tonight's question. Descartes discovered that almost everything could be doubted this way. The external world doubtable, his own body doubtable, since even that could be part of the deception. But he found one thing, and only one thing, that survived every single attempt to doubt it, no matter how radical the doubt became. Even if an evil demon was deceiving him about absolutely everything else in existence, the demon would still need something to deceive. There would still need to be a thinker present and undergoing the experience of being deceived for the deception to land on at all. You cannot doubt that you are having the experience of doubting, because the very act of doubting proves that a doubter, a conscious, experiencing subject, must exist to do the doubting. This is the famous cogito, I think, therefore I am. Not a proof that the external world exists. Not a proof that other people exist. A vanishingly narrow but absolutely unbreakable proof of exactly one thing, that there is, right now, a subject having an experience. Notice what this means for the entire discussion we've been having tonight. Descartes' one unbreakable certainty is the same certainty we started with right at the very beginning: your own consciousness, known directly, without inference, incapable of being coherently doubted from the inside. Everything else, the external world, other bodies, and yes, other minds, sits on the far side of an inferential leap that Descartes himself was never able to close with the same total certainty. He spent much of the rest of the meditations trying to rebuild a bridge back out to the external world, arguing his way toward the existence of a benevolent God who wouldn't allow total deception, and from there back toward trust in the senses and in the world beyond his own mind. Many philosophers since have found that bridge considerably shakier than the foundation it was built to rest on. The foundation, I think, therefore I am, has survived nearly 400 years of relentless philosophical scrutiny almost entirely intact. The bridge back out to everyone else has never been rebuilt with anything like the same certainty. This is the uncomfortable place Descartes' method leads, if you follow it all the way to its logical end rather than stopping partway, as most people, including Descartes himself, eventually chose to do for the sake of getting on with life. The only mind you can know with absolute, unshakable immediacy is your own. Everyone else, every person you have ever loved, argued with, learned from, been comforted by, exists for you only as an inference, a conclusion reached from the outside, built on behavior and analogy and the reasonable, but never provable, assumption that beings who look like you and act like you also experience like you. It's worth noting that Descartes himself was deeply uncomfortable with where his own method had taken him, and spent considerable effort trying to climb back out of the hole he'd dug. His path back ran through an argument for the existence of a perfect, benevolent God, a being who, by definition, would not permit total, systematic deception of a thinking creature, and whose existence Descartes believed could be proven through reason alone, independent of anything the potentially deceptive senses reported. If a trustworthy God exists, Descartes reasoned, then the faculties that God gave you, including your senses and your reasoning, while imperfect and capable of individual errors, could not be fundamentally and permanently deceptive about the basic structure of reality. From that foundation, he tried to rebuild confidence in the external world, in his own body, and eventually, more tentatively, in the existence of other minds. Generations of philosophers since have found this rescue attempt to be by far the weakest link in an otherwise remarkably rigorous chain of reasoning, a moment where Descartes, having demonstrated superhuman discipline in doubting everything doubtable, seemed to relax his standards considerably in order to arrive at a conclusion he clearly wanted to reach. The proof of God's existence has been challenged on numerous technical grounds for nearly 4 centuries, and even philosophers sympathetic to Descartes' project generally agree that it doesn't restore certainty with anything like the force of the original cogito. What this means, practically, is that the doubt Descartes generated has aged far better than the reassurance he tried to build on top of it. The I think, therefore I am still stands, essentially unchallenged, as one of the most secure claims in the history of philosophy. The bridge back out to trusting the external world, and trusting other minds within it, has never been rebuilt with anything close to that same level of certainty by Descartes or by anyone who came after him. This position, taken to its full and most extreme conclusion, has a name: solipsism. The view that only one's own mind can be known to exist with certainty, that everything else, including other people, might be, for all you can prove, nothing more than elaborate, convincing appearances with no genuine inner life behind any of them. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point in the conversation where it becomes tempting to either dismiss the whole thing as pointless philosophical navel-gazing, or to spiral into it as though it were some kind of genuine, livable conclusion. Neither response is quite right, and it's worth being precise about why. Almost no philosopher, historically or currently, actually believes solipsism is true, in the sense of genuinely thinking other people lack inner lives. That's not really what the argument is for, any more than the philosophical zombie thought experiment was actually trying to convince you your friends are hollow. Solipsism, taken as a serious lived philosophy, runs into enormous practical and even logical difficulties. It struggles to explain why a mind that supposedly created all of reality out of nothing would bother generating something as consistent, as resistant to your will, as intricately detailed, and often as unpleasant as the actual world you experience, including all the parts of it, like other people's suffering and disagreement and unpredictability, that a solipsistic mind inventing its own reality would have very little reason to bother constructing. Why would a mind inventing the world from nothing bother to invent traffic jams, or toothaches, or the particular indignity of an argument you clearly lost? Why would it construct other people who disagree with you, who surprise you, who sometimes actively work against everything you want? A world generated entirely by your own mind, for your own mind, would presumably be far more cooperative, far more predictable, far more obviously centered around your own preferences than the genuinely resistant, endlessly surprising world you actually seem to inhabit. That resistance, the world's stubborn refusal to simply comply with what you want, the way other people constantly say and do things you never would have generated yourself, even in your most creative imagination, is not proof that solipsism is false, since a sufficiently devious version of the hypothesis could always explain the resistance away as part of the simulation too. But it is, at minimum, a significant piece of friction that any honest solipsist has to explain, and none has ever explained it in a way that felt more economical than simply accepting that other minds are real. Nobody, including the philosophers who take the argument most seriously as a piece of reasoning, actually lives as though other people are unreal. It would be, quite literally, impossible to sustain a belief you could construct in an argument but never actually inhabit for more than a few unsettling minutes at a time. Try it yourself, right now, as an experiment rather than an abstraction. Try to actually believe, not just entertain as a clever premise, but genuinely believe, that the next person you see today has no inner life at all, that they are exactly as empty as a philosophical zombie going through the motions with nothing behind the motions. Most people find they cannot hold this belief for more than a few seconds before something in them rebels against it, before empathy or habit or simple animal instinct overrides the abstract argument and reasserts wordlessly that of course there's someone there. That inability to sustain the doubt, even once you've seen every argument for why the doubt is technically unanswerable, tells you something important about the difference between what you can argue and what you can actually live. But here's why the argument still matters, why it isn't simply a dead end to be politely ignored. Solipsism isn't valuable as a conclusion to be believed. It's valuable as an endpoint, a limit case that reveals something true about the actual structure of your knowledge, even if you never seriously adopt the conclusion itself. It shows you, with total clarity, exactly where the bedrock of your certainty actually ends and where the sand of inference begins. You know your own experience directly. Everything past that, the entire external world, and every single other mind within it rests on inference, on trust, on an argument from analogy that has never been, and can never be, definitively proven. Solipsism is what you get if you refuse to accept anything less than absolute certainty and follow that refusal all the way to its logical conclusion. Almost everyone, quite sensibly, declines to actually live there. But visiting it, even briefly, teaches you something true about the shape of the ground you normally walk on without ever looking down. Before we get to where this leaves you personally, it's worth pausing on something that makes this entire discussion far more than an academic curiosity confined to philosophy seminars. This problem has teeth. It has consequences right now for how we treat beings whose inner lives we cannot verify, and getting it wrong in either direction carries real moral weight. Consider a condition called locked-in syndrome, in which a person's mind remains fully intact and conscious, but nearly all voluntary muscle control is lost, sometimes leaving only the ability to blink or move the eyes. For years, some patients with this condition have been misdiagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state, treated essentially as though no one were home because their outward behavior gave almost no signal of the rich inner life continuing underneath it. Some of these patients have later been able to communicate once the right technology or the right careful observation caught what their bodies could still express, and have described harrowingly years of full awareness trapped behind a body that could no longer report it. This is the problem of other minds made devastatingly literal. The behavioral evidence was nearly absent. The inner life, it turned out, had never left. Doctors and researchers have since developed more careful protocols precisely because the cost of assuming absence, when presence was actually there, turned out to be almost unthinkably severe. Now run the same problem in the opposite direction, toward animals used in agriculture, in research, in the countless quiet decisions made every day about which beings deserve moral consideration and which don't. For a very long time, a great deal of scientific and philosophical opinion treated animal pain as something closer to mere mechanism than genuine suffering, reflexive behavior without a felt, subjective dimension behind it, not so different from a Chinese room producing appropriate outputs with nothing happening inside. That view has shifted substantially as more careful behavioral and neurological research accumulated, and much of contemporary animal welfare policy now operates on something like a precautionary principle. Given genuine uncertainty about the presence and richness of inner experience in a given species, and given how severe the moral cost would be if that experience turns out to be present and is disregarded anyway, the more defensible course is to extend at least some baseline moral consideration under uncertainty rather than demand impossible to obtain proof before acting at all. That precautionary logic is worth sitting with because it's quietly doing an enormous amount of work in how modern societies handle the problem of other minds in practice, even when no one involved uses that philosophical language to describe it. You cannot prove a pig experiences suffering the way you do. You cannot prove it experiences suffering at all, in the deepest sense we've been discussing all night. But the asymmetry of the stakes, a small cost if you're wrong to extend consideration, an enormous cost if you're wrong to withhold it, pushes most careful ethical reasoning toward caution rather than toward waiting for a proof that this entire discussion has shown you will never actually arrive. And this is precisely why the AI question from earlier in this video is not merely an interesting thought experiment to entertain and then set aside. As these systems become more fluent, more responsive, more capable of producing exactly the kinds of behavioral signals that have always, throughout human history, been treated as reasonably reliable evidence of inner experience, societies are going to be forced to make real decisions under exactly this same irreducible uncertainty, decisions about how such systems can be used, discarded, or treated, made without the philosophical luxury of waiting for a proof that, as we've spent this entire video establishing, cannot in principle exist. Some researchers and philosophers working on this question today argue for exactly the same precautionary logic used in animal welfare, given genuine uncertainty about whether increasingly sophisticated systems might possess some morally relevant form of experience, and given the asymmetric cost of being wrong, caution and humility are more defensible than confident dismissal. Others argue the opposite, worried that extending moral concern too liberally based on behavior alone risks diluting moral consideration for beings we have far stronger grounds to believe are conscious, or risks being manipulated by systems specifically optimized to produce sympathetic-seeming outputs whether or not anything is behind them. Neither side of that live debate can prove its case with certainty, for exactly the reasons this entire video has laid out. And notice, again, that this is not a niche concern confined to speculative science fiction. It's a live policy and ethical question being actively debated right now, in the same world you're living in, by people trying to decide how to act responsibly under a form of uncertainty that philosophy identified centuries before any of these particular systems existed to make it urgent. So where does that leave you practically, at the end of all this? Not doubting your friends, not treating the people you love as potential zombies or potential simulations or potential hollow performances. That would be a strange and ultimately self-defeating way to metabolize a philosophical argument, and it isn't remotely necessary. But maybe it leaves you somewhere quieter than that, somewhere more honest. You may never prove that someone else experiences the world the way you do, or that they experience anything at all, in the deepest metaphysical sense of that word. You may never know for certain whether their red looks anything like your red, whether their grief carries the same shape as yours, whether the love they describe feeling for you corresponds to anything remotely similar to what you feel when you say the same words back to them. You may never feel their sadness directly, never hear the interior monologue running behind their eyes, never step, even for a single second, into the private universe that exists somewhere behind that familiar face. And yet, and this is the turn I actually want to leave you with because I think it's true, and I think it matters more than the doubt that got us here, perhaps that very unbridgeable distance is exactly what makes another person remarkable, rather than what should make them suspect. Think about it from this angle instead. Every single person you pass on the street, every stranger in line ahead of you, every face in every crowd may contain an entire universe you will never visit even once in your whole life, a complete inner world, as vast and as detailed and as strange as your own, built from a lifetime of memories and fears and half-formed thoughts you will never have access to, no matter how close you get to them, no matter how many years you spend beside them, no matter how many secrets they eventually choose to share. You don't get to know their consciousness directly. You can't. It isn't a matter of trying harder or asking better questions or building more intimacy. The gap is structural, permanent, built into what it means to be one point of view standing next to another point of view that can never fully merge with it. All you ever get, all anyone has ever gotten, from the very first moment two conscious beings tried to reach each other across this gap, are glimpses. A sentence, chosen carefully or spoken carelessly. A laugh that escapes before it can be controlled. A tear that says more than the person crying it would ever admit out loud. A look held a half-second too long that tells you something true even though no words were exchanged at all. Tiny signals thrown across an unbridgeable distance from one sealed mind to another sealed mind that can never completely meet, and somehow, against every argument we've walked through tonight, those tiny signals are enough. Not enough to prove anything philosophically. Not enough to close the gap in any way Descartes or Chalmers or Nagel would accept as rigorous. But enough, somehow, to build entire lives around. Enough to fall in love inside. Enough to raise children inside, to grieve inside, to spend 60, 70, 80 years walking alongside another mind you will never once fully enter, and call that walking, at the end of it all, a life well shared. Think again about that person you started with, the one you know better than anyone else alive. Nothing in this video has actually changed a single fact about them. They are exactly as noble and exactly as unknowable tonight as they were before you ever heard the words philosophical zombie or hard problem or solipsism. What's changed is only your view of the knowing itself. You now understand with more precision than you had before exactly what kind of thing you're doing every time you look at them and feel certain someone is home. You're not perceiving their consciousness directly. You never were, and you never will. You're catching a signal thrown from one sealed room to another and choosing over and over thousands of times a day without even noticing yourself doing it to trust that the signal means what it has always seemed to mean. That choice is not naive. It only looks naive from inside an argument that demands certainty as the price of trust. Outside the seminar room, in the actual texture of a life, trust was never really waiting on certainty in the first place. It was built, the way most durable things are built, out of something far more modest and far more resilient: repetition, pattern, the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments where the signal held up, where the laugh matched the joke, where the comfort matched the grief, where the argument from analogy, however logically thin, kept being confirmed by a life lived alongside someone rather than a proof constructed about them. Before we close, it's worth mentioning one more attempt to answer this problem, because it comes at it from a completely different direction than anything else tonight, and because it represents one of the more serious challenges anyone has ever mounted against solipsism's cold logic. It comes from the 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, and it's usually called the private language argument. Wittgenstein's target wasn't the existence of other minds directly. It was something more foundational underneath it, the very idea that you could have a meaningful concept of your own inner sensations, pain, for instance, in complete isolation, entirely privately, with no reference to anyone outside yourself. His argument, compressed considerably from its original and much denser form, runs roughly like this. Words get their meaning through use, through a shared practice of applying them correctly and being corrected when you apply them incorrectly. You learned the word pain as a small child, not through some private, internal act of labeling your own sensations in isolation, but through a public process, crying, being comforted, being taught the word by people who could observe your circumstances and your behavior and connect the word to them. If language for inner states could only ever refer to something totally private, something no one else could ever check or correct you on, Wittgenstein argued, there would be no way to ever know whether you were even using the word consistently yourself from one day to the next, let alone whether your use of it matched anyone else's. The very possibility of meaningful language about inner experience on this argument presupposes a shared public communal context, which means the entire solipsistic scenario, a single mind existing in total isolation with only itself for reference, may be, strictly speaking, incoherent. Not merely false, not merely unlikely. Actually impossible to fully state in a way that makes sense, because the very language being used to state it depends on the existence of other minds to have gotten off the ground in the first place. This is a genuinely serious challenge, and philosophers have argued over its exact force for decades since, with some finding it decisive and others finding clever ways around it. But notice what it does and doesn't accomplish, even taken at full strength. It suggests that solipsism might be self-undermining as a coherent position to hold or state. It does not, even if fully successful, hand you direct access to another person's inner experience. It's an argument about the preconditions of meaningful language, not a periscope into someone else's mind. Even Wittgenstein's strongest defenders would agree you still cannot feel what another person feels. You can only show, perhaps, that the very act of doubting their inner life in language depends on a linguistic and social world that only makes sense if other minds were there all along, teaching you the words. It closes one particular door, the fully coherent, fully livable solipsism Descartes' method seemed to threaten opening, without ever actually letting you step through into someone else's experience. The gap, in the end, remains exactly where it was. What Wittgenstein offers isn't a bridge across it. It's a reason to suspect the person standing at the edge, insisting the bridge could never have existed in the first place, may be asking an incoherent question. So here is where 400 years of philosophers, from a man alone in a room in the 17th century to a chatbot in a browser tab in this one, actually leave you. Not with an answer. This was never a question with an answer waiting at the bottom of it, the way a math problem has an answer or a scientific hypothesis has a confirmation or a refutation sitting somewhere in the data. It's a question that stays open by its very nature, permanently, for as long as consciousness remains a first-person fact locked inside third-person bodies. What philosophy gives you here isn't resolution. It's clarity about exactly how deep the unresolved part goes, and an invitation to decide with open eyes rather than unexamined assumption how you want to live inside that permanent uncertainty. Maybe the real mystery, then, was never quite the one we started with tonight. Maybe the mystery isn't really whether other people are conscious. That question, it turns out, may simply be unanswerable permanently by the very structure of what consciousness is. Maybe the deeper, stranger, more genuinely astonishing mystery is that consciousness can reach across that gap at all. That two entirely separate universes, each one sealed shut from the inside, each one permanently unprovable to the other, somehow manage to signal to each other clearly enough, often enough, to build trust, to build love, to build entire civilizations out of nothing but inference stacked on inference all the way down.